What do you really need from God right now? What do you need from him? I know maybe, we hear all the talk of a new year, fresh start, but maybe we're carrying some things into 2025 that we just maybe didn't deal with in 2024. Maybe things aren't so fresh. Maybe it's not really a new start. Maybe there's a struggle that's in your life that is very real. And so, what do you really need from God right now? What blessing do you want from him? How badly do you want it? There's times when God only releases his blessing on us after a season of prolonged and even painful wrestling with him. Some of you might be there right now. It may be a health problem. Unless God intervenes, there's no hope. Perhaps it's a serious marital or family problem. Maybe it's a financial problem or a desperate need for work. It may be a personal problem such as loneliness or guilt or anger or bitterness or anxiety. It could be maybe even some life-dominating sin such as alcohol or drugs or pornography or gambling. But whatever the problem, you know that you need God. And you know that this morning you're here in this place, and maybe right now you're not calling on him, but I pray by the end of this service that we are calling upon God for the need that we have or needs that we have in our life. In Genesis 32, Jacob faced that kind of crisis. He was returning to Canaan in obedience to God, but that meant he would have to face his brother Esau, whom he cheated 20 years before. Jacob didn't know how Esau would receive him. When Jacob's messengers came back and said that Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men, Jacob, in some sense, he froze with fear. Esau could easily wipe out everything that was of value to Jacob, including Jacob. In Genesis 32, verses 9 through 12, he begins to pray a prayer, and he starts it by saying, "Oh God, deliver me from Esau." Here's the thing, what Jacob didn't know and what we often don't realize in situations like that is how God goes about helping us. What we have in mind is that God would somehow remove our problem or make our enemy go away, but God doesn't do it that way. God answered Jacob's prayer for protection from Esau by wrestling with Jacob until he left him limping as he approached his brother. His plan had been that if Esau attacked one camp, Jacob, being in the other camp, could then escape. He was an escape artist. He was a deceiver. He was a manipulator. He was a schemer. He was even setting himself up in these moments just to protect himself. And maybe that's us. Maybe some of the greatest struggles in our life is because we are the manipulator, because we are the deceiver, because we're always scheming to make sure that we are okay, not considering God and maybe not considering anyone else in our lives. If that is you, I want you to know that you're not the only one. That we have been there in our lives in some way, shape, or form where we just loved ourselves more than anyone else. But God gets a hold of Jacob. Now we see that he couldn't run from Esau if he tried. He was totally dependent on the Lord. That's what we're going to see. And here's the thing, the way that God helps us is by breaking us of our inherent self-dependence so that we have to lean totally on him. You're going to see that. In that context, we can properly receive his blessings. And here's the thing, our problem, like Jacob's, is that all too often we want to use God, we want to use his blessings to further our own ends. All his life, Jacob had been using God and people to get what he wanted for himself. And friends, that is a real temptation. That is a temptation that we wake up to every single day. Am I going to submit and surrender to God's kingdom, or am I going to try to create my own kingdom and make people work for me? That is so real in our life. That is everything that the world is trying to tell you. Oh, do it your own way. Add a little God to your life. Be the manipulator, deceiver. Everyone else is like that too. That's what you got to do to protect yourself. That's what you got to do to get ahead. That's what you got to do to make sure you get what you want. It's okay. Everyone's doing it, right? That's the lie of the world, our culture. That's the lie of Satan to you and to me every single day. But what are we going to do? What we see in this passage and what you're going to see is that God brings Jacob to see that you don't use God. You and I, we don't use God. We submit to God. We submit to him in the wrestling, in the struggle, in the pain. And what does God provide through that? We're going to see this morning, God provides blessing. Jacob, as he's wrestling with God, is holding on, clinging to God, and he says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And God blesses him. So let's figure this out together. Let's walk through this text and let's learn a few things together this morning. So if you stand with me, we're going to read Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32 this morning. It's going to be a way where you leave here. You might have to go back and read some context, but I pray that this will be a challenge to you and to me as we look at these next 21 days with the Lord, and we're praying, God, bless me. It's not wrong to pray that. We're going to see that this morning, right now. This is the word of the Lord to us in Genesis 32, beginning in verse 22. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and set them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of that place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. May God bless through his word. You may be seated this morning. Jacob was facing disaster. This is a little historical context. Years before, he had taken the birthright blessing meant for his brother Esau, and Esau had not forgotten. Keep in mind that Esau was a kind of this burly, kind of rough-hewn, angry kind of man, not the sort that you would want to meet in a dark alley, right? Now, Esau was bearing down on Jacob with an army of 400 men, and the best plan Jacob could devise was to use this kind of Middle Eastern strategy and send Esau a series of carefully selected gifts. You see this beginning in Genesis 32. If you start in verse 1 and kind of read up to 22, you will see what is taking place. And so he sends some gifts to his brother. He's trying to appease his brother. He was hopefully thinking that this would provide a little hope for him and that this would work, that Esau would accept the gifts and that Esau would just forgive. At that point, Jacob did what desperate men should do. He begins to pray. In Genesis 32, 9 through 12, you see him begin to pray. But he didn't sound very sincere, apparently even to himself, because it wasn't just that he prayed and let it go. He continued to act. He continued to try and kind of wiggle out of the disaster that was coming towards him. And he ends up finding himself alone and even more desperate. And a man appeared in the dark to Jacob, and a battle began. In this moment, they begin to wrestle. The arms are twisted, legs were seized, necks were jerked. And all through the night, the wrestling war was waged. And when it became clear that Jacob could not win, he grabbed hold of the stranger and hung on for dear life. And then he uttered this small prayer in Genesis 32:26. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Jacob, in this moment, had taken a hold of God, his opponent in the dark, and refused to let go until God blessed him. Asking for all the blessing that he could get was typical of Jacob. He had asked his father to give him the biggest blessing his father could give, and now he was asking the same of God. In some sense, you read this, and if you know Jacob's life, if you know his history, you consider the boldness, the brashness, and yes, maybe even the greediness of Jacob. In this moment, you would expect, because of Jacob's history, you would expect to rise up and just blast Jacob for making such a request. But God doesn't do that. Isn't that interesting? I mean, Jacob has failed over and over and over again. He's ruined people's lives. And what? God answers his prayer. Our God is a God of mercy. God withholds what we really deserve, and he extends grace. But it's through the wrestling that we're going to see that God gets a hold of Jacob, and Jacob's life is forever changed. God blesses Jacob with a manifold blessing, one with transformation and revelation and direction and protection and impact. And you're just going to kind of see this. You could sit in this text for a really long time and come out with a lot of different things that are applicable, that hit us between the eyes in our own life. But I want to just look at 4 things. So here's number 1. Number 1 is the blessing of God comes in unwanted struggles. The blessing of God comes in unwanted struggles. Take note of what God did when he wrestled Jacob. I mean, Jacob, in some sense, if you know the context, he began the night kind of dreading Esau's arrival. Like if you're dreading something. My daughters, they describe it as the pit in your stomach. And we were just talking about, when do you get that pit in your stomach? And we talked about the different scenarios of when we get that pit in our stomach. For Jacob, he had the pit in his stomach, and he wasn't looking forward to what was coming in the next day or so. He was full of fear. He was full of desperation. But he ended the night of struggle with God's blessing and a renewed faith. That all of our struggling with God in faith, it actually leads somewhere. The struggle that Jacob had with God, it ended up leading to peace. That's the end of the story. Praise God, we can see the end of the story. We don't always see that in the storm. We don't always see that in the struggle. We don't always see that in the wrestling. But with God, in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the difficulty, it ends in faith and it leads to peace. Now, it's interesting that God did not simply speak to Jacob in a dream or a vision as he had done other times. In fact, in Genesis 31:13, he's speaking to Jacob in a dream, in a vision. He didn't do that to reiterate his promise and speak comforting words, did he? No, Jacob's opponent was the angel of the Lord, Jesus Christ, in pre-incarnate form. It was a physical fight with physical injury inflicted on Jacob. And yet there were obvious spiritual lessons impressed on Jacob through this experience. That God was working behind the scenes in the midst of a physical fight to do spiritual things in Jacob's life. God addressed Jacob's fear by requiring him to wrestle all night. I want to be clear, listen, in the text you see that Jacob, he gets alone. In fact, he sends his family across and he comes back and maybe he was coming back to make sure they got everything. I don't know, but he comes back and he comes back alone. Maybe he was coming alone to pray. Maybe he was coming and being alone just in his own nervousness. But it's in that moment where God gets a hold of him. God is the aggressor. God is the one that grabs him, maybe by the hand, and begins to wrestle him. Jacob wasn't laying a hold of God to gain something from him. God was laying a hold of Jacob to gain something from him, namely to bring Jacob to the end of his self-dependence. There's multiple times in our life where God just grabs us. Has your parent ever grabbed you, by your neck, by your shirt, by whatever they can grab? Maybe that's not so healthy. Maybe that's not great parenting skills. I understand that. But in frustration, we've been grabbed. I remember my 5th grade Sunday school teacher, his name's Joe French. He's a pastor over in Ohio. I was a smart aleck kid. I mean, I was. And I deserved what I got. But I remember, today you'd be arrested for this. I remember I was mouthing off and he came up to me and he just grabbed me right behind my neck and squeezed. I mean, I thought I was going to pass out. And he dragged me into the hallway. I deserved it. But you know, that's the kind of the hold that God gets of Jacob in this moment where he grabs him and begins to wrestle him. Jacob was his own adversary, right? But God had to wrestle him into submission to kind of reveal this to him. Have you ever been in a tough spot? You ever been in a struggle? You know God has been doing it to get your attention because you needed your eyes to be opened. You need to be awakened from your slumber, from your ways, from your sin. God gets your attention. He removes your self-dependence to show you that you have nothing without him. This probably felt to Jacob like a badly timed hassle, right? When he just wanted comfort. He just wanted assurance. He was going to face his brother. I mean, can I get a little comfort? Can I get a little assurance? Can I get a little good news? Instead, he gets a wrestling match. And that's the reality. The reality is that the blessing of God comes in unwanted struggles. We're not looking for the struggle, but God brings the struggle to us, to get to what we really need spiritually in our life, to do a work that only God can do. The thing is that we're all like Jacob. I know we like to stand back from Scripture and say, man, Jacob was an idiot. I mean, he was wrestling with God. I mean, if I was wrestling with God, listen to what I would do. Really? I mean, we get a splinter and we complain. We cry. We tell everyone. It's just the smallest thing. So many times in our life, we're like Jacob. We think that the enemy, we think the problem is out there. The problem is my wife. The problem is my husband. The problem is my parents. The problem is my boss. The problem is my poor circumstances. God, please take care of the problem for me. But the enemy or problem isn't primarily out there. The problem is in you and me. The problem is in my flesh, my sinful, selfish nature. That's the problem, and it dominates our lives. So God has to reveal to me the power of my flesh before I can actually be delivered from it. God does this in our lives through struggles that we don't want, but God knows what works together for our good. The blessing of God comes in unwanted struggles, and when God brings you the struggle, don't run from it. He's doing something. The second thing that we see in verses 24 and 25, the pain of the struggle actually increases our faith. The pain of the struggle actually increases our faith. In Genesis 32, 24, and 25, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. I mean, obviously, God could have crippled Jacob in the first minute of this contest. When he finally wanted to, he just touched Jacob's hip, and Jacob felt excruciating pain as his hip was dislocated. So the question you might ask is, so why didn't God do it sooner? Why did he allow the match to go on all night long? In some sense, God wanted to show Jacob the power of his own self-will. If you've ever wrestled, you know how exhausting it is to struggle with an opponent of equal or greater strength. It just wears you out. I mean, I know what it's like wrestling with a 10-year-old, and it wears me out. Right? A few minutes is enough, but Jacob kept at it. You see that. He kept at it all night. He would not stop wrestling with this man. And in this moment, he just knows it as a stranger. He doesn't know exactly that it's God. But the Lord kept waiting to see if Jacob would surrender. But Jacob wouldn't surrender. He wouldn't quit. He wouldn't give in. He wouldn't throw in the towel. He was in the fight. I think there's many times that God sees what we are made of. Jacob, he keeps fighting. I mean, at what point, as you're reading this story, at what point do you suppose Jacob recognized that his opponent was not just a mere man? Later in Genesis 32:30, he acknowledged that it was God, but the text doesn't tell us. But I'm sure that if he didn't know before, Jacob knew as soon as the Lord crippled him. And we know the Lord crippled him because later on he goes to his brother with a limp. What was God doing? The Lord didn't use the power until he saw that Jacob would not yield. You know, the flesh in all of us, it dies pretty hard, doesn't it? Only God can tame it. Until God crippled him, Jacob wouldn't give in. God let him wrestle all night so that Jacob could see how strong his self-will really was. And here's the thing, we're all like Jacob. We won't cling to the Lord with all of our strength until we have to. As long as there's an ounce of self-dependence left, we will actually trust in ourselves. We'll actually go with us instead of God. I mean, Jacob was running away from God his entire life, but God didn't want him to run away anymore and wanted to solve the issue there and then. And this had the effect of making Jacob even more vulnerable to Esau, forcing Jacob's faith to more fully rest on God and not himself. God gives you a limp so that you will lean on him, so that you will look to him, so that you will trust him. If necessary, God will cause us to limp to increase our faith. It's important to note that in verse 25, the man said he wasn't winning, right? God in this moment says he isn't winning. God could have overcome Jacob easily and instantly, but he let his struggle go on and let him think. He let Jacob think that he was winning. Don't miss that small little point. God actually loves to wrestle with you. I know, we're like, hey, can I have the more simple life? Can I have the easier life? Can I have a life of less wrestling? I mean, some of you are in a struggle right now with God, and God loves it. Why? Because the opposite of struggle is actually walking away from God. The opposite of struggle is running away from God. The opposite of struggle is serving yourself. Clinging to yourself. God would rather have you fighting with him than actually running from him. And so please hear me. When God calls us to wrestle with him, there's always more going on than we first understand. And God always uses it to transform us for our good. When God makes us wrestle him for some blessings, it's not because God is reluctant to bless you. It is because he has more blessings for us in the struggle than without the struggle. And for us, we're like, there's got to be a simpler way. I mean, have you ever seen, it's usually like a reel and the road is like this and someone just draws a straight line. Like, why couldn't we just do it like that? We all want just the straight line, but honestly, all of our lives is up and down, and it's just the windy roads of the backside of Kentucky, right? It's in the hills and valleys, up and down, in and out of the curves, over and over and over again. And that is life. God has more for you in those curves, in the difficulty, in the struggle, than in just a straight line. But do we want to learn what he's trying to teach us? When God makes us wrestle with him for any kind of blessing, it's not because he's reluctant to bless you. He is not withholding from you. You actually need the struggle to get the blessing that God has for you. The pain of the struggle increases our faith. Number 3, in the struggle, God makes you face who you really are. In the struggle, God makes you face who you really are. In verses 27, 28, it says, and he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. I mean, to make sure that Jacob had learned the lesson, the Lord asked him a question which at first doesn't seem to kind of like fit the context. Jacob is finally subdued and he clings to the Lord and says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And the Lord responds, what is your name? Listen, God is not asking a question that he doesn't know the response, that he doesn't know the answer to. He knew the answer. He wanted Jacob to confess not just his name, but actually his character. In the Hebrew, their name was who they were. It was their character. And so Jacob is the deceiver. Jacob is the supplanter. Jacob is the schemer. Jacob is the one that manipulates. And he wanted Jacob to say it out loud so that Jacob could even hear it. Hey, do you hear who you are, Jacob? Do you know who you are? He had to say, my name is Jacob. My name is, I am the deceiver. I am the manipulator. I am the schemer. Notice, just get it in the context, right? Only after Jacob acknowledged and faced who he really was, that the Lord actually blessed him. Friends, for you and for me this morning, in the struggle, God makes you face who you really are. Just say it. Just name it. Confessing who you are should make you cling tighter to God. Jacob, in this moment, he just doesn't let go. He could have. In that moment of realization, he could have just held his head low and he could have walked away from the wrestling match in that moment. But he didn't. He was admitting who he was. God showed him. God made him say it. And this is a moment of confession. It's a moment of repentance. Listen, I know many times we're like, pray a prayer. Like, no, just be raw and real with God. God doesn't want some big theological language from you. He wants your heart. He wants your mind. He wants reality in your life. Just bring it before him and say, this is who I am. Jesus, would you help me? I don't even like who I am. Jacob was at that place. When Jacob clings to the Lord and demands that he bless him, the Lord gives him a new name. To the Hebrews, the name reflects the character. So God, speaking prophetically in this moment, gives Jacob a new character. Instead of Jacob, he is now to become Israel. Instead of supplanter, he's to become a prevailer. The name Israel means the one who strives with God. It can also mean that God strives with him. Well, both meanings are true. Jacob wrestled with God and prevailed in the sense of hanging on until God blessed him. Get this, the name change indicated a transformation of heart. There's a positive side to Jacob's personality, and God was obviously impressed with his prevailing perseverance. He had held on and hung on in the midst of God, and he reminds him who he has been. Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And God responds, don't forget who you are. But I am the one who changes you. In essence, Jacob realizes the schemer needs to die. What needs to die in us? 21 days of prayer and fasting is to get to what needs to die in us. To really walk with God. To really spend time with him. You're like, I don't even know where to start. In the first couple pages of the booklet, it just gives you some ideas on how to start. We need help. We need someone to tell us, hey, start like this. Maybe you didn't have parents that said, do it like this. Maybe you didn't have grandparents to speak into your life saying, do it like this. No one's ever modeled it for you. Okay, this is a safe place for you to grow and flourish in Christ, and so begin to figure it out, right? Spend the rest of the day writing out a plan to be with God, to be before him in your life. Here's the thing. When you admit who you really are, it doesn't deter God. Your confession opens you to God's blessing. That facing God's truth about our lives always results in something good. It may not be a bright outlook. You confessing who you really are might be very discouraging to you. But if you open yourself up to God, it always results in something good, because that's where he is leading you, and you're being obedient to follow him to that place. Facing God's truth about your life always results in something good. For Jacob, the limp led to humility. Who he really was led to humility. Humility will bring more blessing to your life than your pride ever will. Be humble and trust God and keep following him through the struggle, through the difficulty, and don't let go. God, bless me. Now, notice that Jacob, in the prayer, this is a side note, Jacob did not define what the blessing should be. He left it up to God. He trusted God and said, God, I just need your blessing. You know what? God knows what you need most. So trust him. We are such control freaks. It makes me so angry when I see it rise up in me. I get anxiety because of the lack of control and at times in my own life, right? It's like, I just want to know that everything's going to be okay. And we do not know that. That is faith. The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. If you can see it and do it on your own, you don't need faith. And we need God. We need to trust what he is doing. Don't forget, you are a soul made by God, made for God, and made to need God, which means you were not made to be self-sufficient. God brings Jacob to the end of his self-sufficiency. I wonder if Jacob was tired of running from God. I wonder if he was tired of always being strained. You know, when you live with a half-hearted devotion, your soul is always strained. It's always stretched to the max. Have you followed the progression? God will bring struggles into our lives that cause us to limp, to make us more vulnerable, to make us dependent on him. I mean, in essence, God took Jacob's power away right before he was to stand and defend against his brother. God makes us vulnerable so that we will lean on him instead of ourselves. Struggle leads to strength. Struggle leads to forgiveness. Struggle leads to a new identity. Struggle leads to a blessing. In the struggle, God makes you face who you really are. This is the fourth and last point. God's blessing leads to greater humility. I just want to walk through just the rest of this story quickly as we close this morning. Genesis 32, 29 through 32. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. He is declaring the grace and mercy of God in this moment. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. When Jacob chose the Hebrew word Peniel, which means the face of God, to commemorate the sight, he was clearly aware that he'd been given a rare and glorious opportunity. He had a face-to-face encounter with the living God and lived to tell about it. At Peniel, God revealed himself to Jacob in a life-changing way. God touched his hip, dislocated his hip, and changed the way that he walked the rest of his life. But more importantly, God touched his heart and changed the way that he lived the rest of his life. This is a defining moment where Jacob holds on and asks for God's blessing, and God's blessing brings about transformation. But look how it's walked out in Genesis 33, verses 1 through 3. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two female servants, and he put the servants with their children in the front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. And he himself went on before them. That's really powerful right there. Before, he was sending his family out there, right? He was dividing his whole family to make sure that he was protected in one area. But now you see him putting his family there, and he's leading his family before his brother in an act of humility. Why? Because he was no longer the deceiver. He was no longer the manipulator. He was no longer the schemer. He was the one who was striving with God, because his life was changed. He bows before his brother 7 times as an inferior would before a highly honored person. Genesis 33:4, but Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So instead of killing Jacob, Esau embraced him and Esau kissed him. And together they begin to cry. Years of deep bitterness and years of deep guilt were erased in a few moments. God had blessed Jacob with protection in the face of sure death. Here's the thing. This little prayer, I will not let you go unless you bless me, impacted a whole lot of lives. All those with him, Jacob, his wives, children, servants, and livestock were spared. Among those, his son Judah, from whom the Messiah would descend. So in a sense, Jacob's prayer is even affecting us even today because of the lineage. Beyond that, Esau's life was wonderfully altered. He let go of a lifetime of bitterness toward his overly aggressive brother. Instead of killing Jacob, he embraces him. Yet the biggest change we see is in Jacob. Jacob not only had a new name, but he had a new heart. And just notice how the story ends. In Genesis 33, 8 through 11, Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." But Jacob said, "No. Please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me in the same way that God has accepted me, the same way that God has embraced me. I don't deserve the embrace. I don't deserve it from God. I don't deserve it from my brother, but your arms are extended. The embrace is warm. Please." Do you feel that? Please accept my blessing that it is brought to you because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough. Thus he urged him, and he took it. Can you imagine Jacob begging Esau to please take my blessing? Jacob, the one who had previously stolen his brother's blessing, has been changed by God and is now eager to give a blessing. It makes sense, doesn't it? When God gets a hold of our life, it's nothing for us to want to then desire to pour out our lives for him because the warm embrace is real. And the warm embrace is real maybe through the struggle and maybe through the wrestling and maybe through the difficulty that you find your life in right now. It's worth it. It's worth the wrestling. Humility follows. And God uses you as he blesses you, he blesses others. So I'll ask again as we close, what do you really need from God right now? What blessing do you want from him? How badly do you want it? God, he will meet you in your anguish, your fear, your uncertainty, but he may not meet you in the way that you expect or desire. Jacob was looking for comfort and he got a wrestling match. But blessing came through that struggle. Your greatest ally may show up looking at first like your adversary, inciting you maybe to wrestle him like God did. If so, I would encourage you in your life just to remember Jacob. So many blessings in wrestling. You may not need soft words of comfort. You may not need to be left alone with your thoughts. You may not need sleep. You may not even need a healthy hip. What you need is God's blessing. What is that? God, I'm just holding on to you. And I'm asking you to bless me. I'm asking for your help. So in your life, when God calls you to wrestle with him in prayer, it's an invitation to receive his blessing. Stay with him. Don't give up. Don't let him go until he blesses you. He loves to bless, that kind of tenacious faith. And what happens? You and I, we come out transformed. So as we begin these 21 days of prayer, what is it that you need to call out to God with? What is it that's on your heart? What is it that you've been wrestling with in your mind? What is it that's been maybe discouraging you? Well, this morning we're just simply going to pray. I'm going to go to the back of the room. If I can help you, if I can pray with you in any way, I'm going to be right back there. But I want to leave the altar open. I pray that we are bold and courageous, that we're not afraid to just lay it down and say, God, I just need your blessing. I don't even know what that is. I don't even know what's best for me, God, right now, but you do, and I trust you.